I first started watching Faith Unaltered because I'm kind of obsessed with my particular doctrines that are, I grew up with, that I'm enthusiastic about, that I think they're true. And so I like sharing that, what I think is a truth that a lot of people don't see or whatever. So I like the conversation or whatever. And yes, I want to convert people to believe what the Bible's teaching, what I think it's teaching, especially if it's something that I think most people mess up, then that it can be shown from the text, which is why I'm rooted in the idea of sola scriptura, because of the positions I hold. Most other believers don't see those things. And so you can take that as me wanting to convert you from, like, it's, Adventist or cult, and they want to convert you to their cult. It's like, I don't care really. If I just want people to believe what's true. And I do think it's right. So, I mean, whatever. If I can just influence you to not believe things that aren't true about God, that I'm convinced it's the case, then that's a win. And even if you don't agree, we can still be friends. I have my ups and downs, but I remember when I really like Faith Unaltered, the channel. And like one of the guys is Protestant, one of them is kind of mixed, non-denominational. Tyler's like, is a catechumen in the Orthodox Church. And anyways, it's a cool channel, check it out. But I remember I sent him this paper a couple times and kind of started a friendly debate about it. And, they're really busy or whatever, so we never really talked about it. But I was just reviewing that paper, and I posted these quotes from some early church fathers. I'd be curious what Orthodox would say about, or Catholics, because I think Irenaeus is a saint, right? And Tertullian, I'm not sure, but like they seem to have beliefs that go against what's assumed in some of the councils. And it's a pretty weighty doctrinal difference that agrees with me in certain ways. Okay, so the intermediate state is the theological category, and some traditions don't even really have a category for this because they think when you die you go straight to heaven or hell, but that's just kind of like poor man theology. It's just kind of like simpleton. That doesn't, because there's all sorts of issues, like in the question about what is the state of the dead, those who have died. You have the intermediate state, which would be the period of a person's death until the end of the world. What does that look like? And then you have a pre-cross question there. Is there, you have the question of, is the person conscious? Are they are they like in the spiritual realm? Is that literal language when it talks about Sheol and Hades being a place where people are, and then maybe use descriptive language for it? Is that literal? Is Luke 16 teaching something literal about the nature of the intermediate state after one's death prior to the second coming? Why is that a category? Is the harrowing of hell when Jesus dies for 3 days, does he change the state of the human being in the intermediate state after the cross prior to his second coming? Do people now go to heaven when they die? And if that's true, do the lost then just go straight to hell also, or do they sit in wait of the judgment, which Jesus talks about him being the judge of the quick and the dead at his coming? So I think you can see where doctrinal misunderstandings could develop in a certain trajectory based on certain false understandings. I'm going to argue that an astute person of Scripture who has a dualist conception of a conscious intermediate state and takes the harrowing of hell in a more literal sense, where Jesus changes the state of the standing, which is true, by the way. The cross changes the state of the standing of those in Sheol who are righteous. But then the question, so if that's true and we take that literally, and so the saints are taken to heaven after Jesus ascends from hell, right, or from Hades, from the grave, right? Now we have, well, the saints are in heaven. Well, the early church didn't say that. They certainly didn't say across the board. Some of them said, well, if the martyrs, look at the book of Revelation, we have the martyrs under the altar, okay, which I think is a misunderstanding of the imagery here. But so some of them started to say, well, and people speculate about, well, is this because they were expecting Jesus any time in the very early church, and then when he didn't come, they had to start explaining, well, what about the saints who have died? Well, it seems like in Revelation we can point to the martyrs. So if you're a martyr, you go straight to heaven to be with Christ if you die as a martyr. But the rest are still waiting in Sheol. And there's no early father the early fathers didn't, when they spoke about, actually, I don't want to get sidetracked on that. Paradise in the intertestamental period is spoken of being like in the earth. And so some people think when the thief in paradise that very day, which I don't think you have to read it that way. He's saying, truly, I tell you today, you will be with me in paradise. Today just serves to emphasize. And by the way, the Old Testament God talked that way all the time. I tell you today, I call heaven and earth as a witness against you this day. So no, you can say, if Jesus is the Old Testament God, he might speak like the God in Deuteronomy, which may have actually given the man hope that he spoke with authority in such a way. He's declaring this day, you will be with me in paradise, even though you're just turning to me now at the last moment. What a beautiful picture there. Anyways, that aside, but people have taken that, and the comma in the English reflects the theological interpretation of the translator and the scribe, in points in history. And I've read articles about this before. But they believe that paradise, and you can support this from the intertestamental period, when the people were going astray and didn't have a prophet for 400 years. But okay, you can point to the intertestamental period that has eternal conscious torment, annihilationism, and universalism all mixed in the literature, which isn't inspired. But okay, go ahead. And then they say, well, then that must mean he took paradise out from Sheol, I guess, which is like synonymous with Abraham's bosom, the good side of the grave, and then took it to heaven. Well, no, paradise comes from this idea. It's in the ancient Near East. It comes from the idea of where the God is a garden, and it's pristine. It's a paradise, like probably stems from an original idea that's true, like Eden, where God was originally in the golden age in Eden before the fall. And when Paul talks about a man he knew some 14 years ago, who's probably talking about himself to not brag, he mentions he was caught up into the third heaven. And then he uses synonymously with that in paradise, where the angels are, where God is, in the third heaven, which is paradise. So the Bible knows nothing about paradise being in the earth. Okay. Paradise is Eden. Paradise is in restored Eden. Paradise is in where God lives. Okay. Paradise is the third heaven. It's not in the earth. Well, that's after Jesus. Well, yeah, but you're not getting it from the text. I'll just point that out. You could say, well, Eden was buried in the flood, so it was like underground, some sort of weird mix of like literal and conceptual ideas. That's where my mind goes when I think about why they would have said paradise is underground, buried in the flood, I guess. And Jesus is overturning the judgment of, death or whatever. It's like the weird conceptual idea pulled from like a literal, I don't even know what to do with that, but it's interesting. But I think it's made up. Paradise is where God is where the God is, sort of thing. So people are just forcing that into it because of their misunderstanding of I tell you today or whatever. Anyways, back to the thing. So pre-cross, post-cross, literal, stuck there alive, underground, even though the devil's the one that said you'll never die. That's all confused. But so we have a couple issues going on. If you think that he takes the saints directly to heaven, because after all, they're redeemed through the blood of Jesus, they won't pass into judgment. What does that mean exactly? There's lots of verses that talk about everybody has to come before the judgment seat of Christ. Believers and unbelievers will be judged by Christ. is the judgment seat of Christ and the white throne judgment. These categories people have made really different things. Kind of, but I don't think it's putting titles on these different things. It's just talking about it's become a category because of its use. The idea is that everybody passes before the judgment of Christ in some sense. And the text indicates that is executed and the separation is made at Christ's coming. But you can speak about a final judgment later of the wicked in Revelation. And that is a different judgment in the way it's executed finally. But that doesn't mean the concept of everyone being judged by Christ at the end of the world isn't true. You won't pass into judgment in the sense like, just like it says, don't judge lest you be judged. It's not saying don't use discernment, which is judgment, right? So judgment is a really interesting word that should be studied carefully, and its range of use in context is you can lead to false conclusions. If you assume judgment doesn't have that range, you actually would put the Bible in contradiction with itself if you were consistent. Okay, so here's what's interesting. If you say that the saints don't come into judgment in that sense of like being risked of being lost, which is basically true. That's not true that they're going to be at risk of the final judgment if they're believers, right? So if the saints all go straight to heaven when they die, then it's kind of reasonable to think, well, then the non-believers are already judged too, so they can go to hell too, right when they die, right? Because if the good group is already free, well, then if you're not part of that group, why wouldn't you go to hell? So you can see how one false understanding historically would just lead to that misunderstanding and kind of laziness with the text. And then it's like, well, okay, yeah, but what about all these resurrection passages and final judgment passages? Oh, well, God's going to pull them out of hell just to throw them back in there when he judges them again. And the saints are going to come back as immaterial souls with Jesus, and he's going to make them get in your hole there, buddy. I got to do that resurrection thing I said in scripture that I'm going to do, where I raise your body, even though I don't really need your body in the grave, which may or may not be dust by now. I don't need it to be those molecules, but I still need you to get in the hole. Okay. Just get in the hole. Don't you want to go in the hole? Get in your pit. I got to fulfill my work. You know what I mean? It's like, what's the point of the resurrection? What's the point of the final judgment? If the judgment's finished at the cross in such a way that they can go to hell before the end of the world. Now, with all that in mind, let's look at this thing from Tertullian. So you can kind of see as you read some fathers, like, I'm not saying this is 100% right. I'm just saying I want to point out a few details of what he did say. What they all did seem to say against the Gnostics, by the way. I don't have the quote here, and I don't have the citations, but I'll get them. If somebody wants the citations, I can dig them out or whatever. I just don't have them in this quote because I didn't include them. But what most of the earliest church fathers did say, and sometimes in opposition to the Gnostics, is that you do not go to heaven until after the resurrection. And what they pointed to was that Christ had to go into the grave, and they have different ideas about what that looks like metaphysically or literally. And they said, well, Jesus had to suffer being dead for 3 days, and he didn't ascend into heaven until he was resurrected in his body. Why? And they would say to Justin Martyr says, if a man thinks he goes to heaven as an immortal soul before, immediately upon death, we should not think of that man as a Christian. And then he goes on to speak about that's what the Gnostics believe. So you can wiggle your way out of it and say, well, yeah, he was saying, because he was referring to a Gnostic doctrine and then condemning the Gnostics for not simply that reason, right? But that was the reason he gave, to show how they're not of us, that their soul goes immediately to heaven upon death. And you see this in the other church fathers. It's like, wait a minute, the judgment hasn't happened yet. They have to be, Augustine even said, they have to be judged for what they did in the body and the soul. Oh, see, Jamie, they're dualists, though. They don't agree with you. Doesn't matter. That's not the point. The point is they have something right here that doesn't make sense if you don't, that they pointed to, which is people have to be judged. And like Jesus, who didn't ascend until after his bodily resurrection, he's now the judge. And if you jaunt off to heaven before the judgment, what's the point of the judgment? Because as soon as you say the saints go to heaven, then that means everybody else would be already judged to go to hell in that sense. It's like it's putting the cart before the horse. And that's what they all pointed to, whether it be Augustine or Justin or Tertullian or Irenaeus. So let me show you. Here's from Irenaeus against heresies. I don't have the chapter and verse in front of me. If then the Lord observed the law of the dead, this is the argument right here to start with, the law of the dead, that he might become the first begotten from the dead, and tarried until the third day in the lower parts of the earth, then afterwards rising in the flesh, so that he even showed the print of the nails to his disciples, he thus ascended to the Father. If all these things occurred, I say, how must these men not be put to confusion who allege that the lower parts refer to this world of ours, and that their inner man, leaving the body here, ascends into the supercelestial place? For as the Lord went away in the midst of the shadow of death, where the souls of the dead were, yet afterward arose in the body, and after the resurrection was taken up to heaven, it is manifest that the souls of the disciples also, upon whose account the Lord underwent these things, shall go away into the invisible place allotted to them by God, and there remain until the resurrection, awaiting that event. Then receiving their bodies and rising in their entirety, that is bodily, just as the Lord arose, they shall come thus into the presence of God. And there, rising and in their entirety, that is bodily, just as the Lord arose, they shall come thus unto the presence of the Lord, or of God. For no disciple is above the master, but every one that is perfect shall be as his master. Luke 6:40. As our resurrection prescribed by the Father, which has been also shown forth through Jonas, and rising again, or Jonah, and rising again after 3 days was taken up, so ought we also to await the time of our resurrection prescribed by God and foretold by the prophets, and so rising, be taken up, as many as the Lord shall account worthy of this privilege. Now think about that. You don't go to heaven until the resurrection, and you go to heaven in the resurrection. Interesting. How many theologies can deal with that? I know of none except for one, to be honest. Now, I'm not saying they agree with my theology entirely, obviously, but this thing he's arguing would mean this. You don't go to heaven when you're dead until after you're resurrected. The resurrection is at the judgment at the end of the world, and when Christ returns bodily. And when he does that judgment and they come into the presence of the Lord, not until that time, and they're taken to heaven at that time, that's premillennial, because they're getting this from 1 Thessalonians 4, and the verse is cited. So they affirm you do go to heaven. The marriage supper of the Lamb is in heaven. It's taking Jesus, bringing with him those who fell asleep back to the heaven where he's been. John 14. They're taken to heaven bodily like Jesus. They don't go to heaven until the resurrection. They do go to heaven. Think about that. All those things are true. Very interesting. What else do we got here? One other quote. So there's Irenaeus. Now, is he a saint? Is it okay to believe that then? Is it okay to believe you don't go to heaven when you die? If you believe he's a saint, does he disagree with councils? I wonder on that point. That's a pretty big theological claims there, as he's arguing against heresies. He's arguing against Gnostics here. That's what that he says. How much these men not be put to confusion, who allege that the lower refers just to this world of ours and that the inner man, leaving the body here, ascends into the super celestial place. Now, you can get out of it and say that's not exactly what you believe because you don't believe like the Gnostics. But yes, you do if you think your inner man is freed from this lower world and goes to this super celestial place before the resurrection. And that the intent of God, that you need to, your spirit gets set free. And let's say you might say something like, you're more alive than you were on earth in the body, in the embodied state that God intended for humans in the creation. And what we look to at the end, which is to be embodied on the earth, restored, and that the flesh is good. Do you say things like, I go straight to heaven before the resurrection, and I'm, quote, more alive than ever, as opposed to embodied? That's not what God teaches. That's not in my Bible. My Bible says the flesh is good. God created us to be good, very good, in fact. And he promises to restore that. That's why Jesus comes back to make people who aren't alive, because God's death is the enemy, not the setting free of the soul that makes me, quote, more alive than ever. Pagan, hint, no offense. I'm passionate. Sorry, I'm excited about it. Forgive me. Okay, so here's Tertullian. And again, if you just have to leave a message if you want the citation here. But take my word for it. If you don't trust me, ask me for it. If you want it or you don't trust me, just ask. How indeed shall the soul mount up to heaven, where Christ is already sitting at the Father's right hand, when as yet the archangel's trumpet has not been heard by the command of God? It's 1 Thessalonians. When as yet those whom the coming of the Lord is to find on the earth have not been caught up into the air to meet him at his coming. 1 Thessalonians 4:17. In company with the dead in Christ, who shall be the first to arise? To no one is heaven opened. The earth is still safe for him. I would not say it shut against him. When the world indeed shall pass away, then the kingdom of heaven shall be opened. Shall we then have to sleep high up in ether with the boy-loving worthies of Plato, or in the air with Arius, or around the moon with the Endymions of the Stoics? No, but in paradise, you tell me, whither already the patriarchs and prophets have removed from Hades in the retinue of the Lord's resurrection, how is it then that the region of paradise, which is revealed to John in the Spirit, lay under the altar? Revelation 6:9 displays no other souls as in besides the souls of the martyrs. See, he's arguing that this indicates that paradise is in heaven and the souls of the martyrs are in paradise because of Revelation 6, which I disagree with, but you could see where that would be read that way or why he might think that. But that's just imagery of saying those martyrs who died for the cause of Christ are under the blood of the altar where Christ died for us. And they're crying out, how long, O Lord? Because they're dead. It's imagery of people needing to be avenged for the cause of Christ that were murdered. But it's the imagery is saying they're covered, and the righteous cry of the saints is for the Lord to avenge their deaths. And it's indicating that he will because they're covered under the altar. That's what that means. It doesn't mean there's like this altar in heaven and there's corpses without their heads screaming from their necks that they want to be avenged, even though they're already in heaven with God, but albeit trapped under an altar until some unappointed time where God's keeping them captive until the end of the world. The imagery is not talking about like the nature of, I don't mean to be rude or whatever, but it's kind of funny to me, to be honest. I'm just being honest. I'm being honest about how that is just silly to me in hopes to kind of convince you to come to a better reading. So forgive me for that. I just like, what are we saying here? We're saying they're literally under an altar because the imagery is supposed to be literal to teach us about the nature of heaven and hell, or the state of the dead after. No, the picture here is that they need to be avenged, and so their lives, which are in the Lord's hands, cry out for vengeance. Just like, shall we say, Abel's blood, the first murder of the innocent man, blood was spilled on the earth, has a voice box, and it says, crying out, Lord, avenge me, Lord, avenge. It's like, no, a picture paints 1,000 words, man. Before a holy and righteous God, a good God, the first murder of an innocent man spilled on the ground. It's like the lipstick. There's a wife taking care of her children diligently somewhere, and the husband's out working, and he works on the road, and he has to stay at motels and the wife, faithful wife, is at home taking care of the kids in the house, and the man is out on his business trip, and he steps out of a hotel room, and you hear someone else in the room with him, and you look at his collar, and it's unbuttoned, his belt's loose, and he's kind of sweaty, and you see on his white collar lipstick, and his wife is at home taking care of the kids, reading them a bedtime story. That lipstick on the man's collar cries out to God, screams to God. How is it then that the region of paradise, which is revealed to John in the Spirit, let's see, a new specialty altered and adapted to receive the newcomer? Observe then the difference between a heathen and a Christian in their death. If you have to lay down your life for God, as the Comforter counsels, it is not in gentle fevers and on soft beds, but in the sharp pains of martyrdom. You must take up your cross and bear it after your master, as he has himself instructed you. You have a treatise by us on paradise, in which we have established a position that every soul is detained in safekeeping in Hades until the day of the Lord. Albeit except the exception of martyrs, perhaps, due to revelation, what it says. But you have a treatise from us, the fathers, Tertullian speaking, about paradise, that we have established the position that every soul is detained in safekeeping in Hades, the underworld, until the day of the Lord, with the exception of the martyrs, perhaps. And he cites Revelation. That's what he's saying. So, is Tertullian a saint? I wonder. Is it permitted to believe what the Bible teaches, like Tertullian affirmed and Irenaeus affirmed? I wonder. There's reasons textually why this view is right. And I think he's misunderstanding the exception of the martyrs. It's a misreading of the type of literature and imagery that's going on in Revelation. But you can see why he might think what he does, especially being poisoned by the Platonic dualism of his time, of which he comes from. So I love it. I love this stuff.